So that is all set to go. Excellent. Recording has begun, and we are right about at 10 o'clock. So welcome, everyone. Glad to have you with us today for our second new AD Zoom meeting. This is a very special one to me, and I think you're going to find it extremely valuable to have Jan Dolezal working with you this morning. As we get started, and before I do a little brief introduction, I just want to remind everyone to type in your name as you join, and so that you can indicate, so we know who we're working with and who is following us. And then mute, if you would please, your background noise so we can keep your background noise out. It's down in the lower left-hand corner. If you have questions, you feel free to use the chat button that's available, and you can type in your question, or you can raise your hand and unmute yourself so that you can actually ask a question of Jan. That is just fine to do as well. Again, if there are any issues that are other than questions that Jan has, feel free. We're glad to respond. We've got many of our WIA executives are online as well and can help out, and I'll do my best to help you with those responses too. So with that being said, let's get things rolling. This is a special presentation today on legal issues. Most of the time we have done this during our normal presentation, but it's so valuable we wanted to get a recording of it and be able to share it not only with our new ADs, but with all of our athletic directors. And Jan Dolezal has been doing this for us for a long, long time, and we can't thank her enough. Jan was the Commissioner of Athletics for the Milwaukee Public Schools from 1974 until 2002, when she retired. In 1999, she was so valuable that she was inducted into the Wisconsin Athletic Hall of Fame. And that's only one of many, many recognitions that Jan has been honored with. And the list goes on and on. I could read that for a long time. But most importantly, in recent years since retiring, she's been a legal consultant for Piersky and Gray in Milwaukee, and has been contacted on a number of occasions as an expert witness in sports-related litigation. And the WIA has used her on numerous occasions. We consider her a very dear friend, but more importantly, she's an inspiration for not only female athletic directors and females participating in sport, but for all athletic directors, men and women. And I consider her just to be a true hero of high school sport. So I'm very pleased to have Jan provide you with legal issues and student athletic programs today. And I think you're going to find this a really valuable presentation. Jan, all yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning to everybody. Probably the easiest way for you to listen to this is to just listen. The PowerPoint will be online, and there will also be an access for you on the WADA website to 3 different items. The first one is an Interscholastic Athletic Handbook for parent. It's called the Parent Athlete Handbook. The second one is the Coach's Procedure Manual. And then the third one, which is really valuable for you, are all of the forms that are referred to in either the Coach's Procedure Manual or the Parent Athlete Handbook. We're also going to try and put that on the WIAA site as well as the WADA site. Okay, let's get started. What is risk management? If you don't get anything else out of this presentation, I want you to get 2 things out of the presentation. Ask what if. What if something happens? What if a parent calls you about an award that their student didn't get? What if there's an injury? What if something happens and a bus doesn't come? If you don't have a procedure in place, then put one in place. And the second one is, if it's not in writing, it doesn't exist. So ask what if you don't have an answer, put it in writing, put it in a policy or procedure, and make sure if it isn't in writing, it doesn't exist. Next thing I want to talk about is it doesn't do you any good to be reactive. If something happens and you have to react, it's too late. The easiest way for you to protect yourself is to take proactive steps to prevent injuries or challenges to your program before they occur. Will you be able to do that for everything? No. I couldn't do it for everything in 28 years. But the more proactive steps you take, the safer your program will be. Once a crisis situation occurs, take steps to mitigate it immediately. Make sure you understand as the AD what happened, what your coaches did, what exactly happened on that day, who came to help, and mitigate the crisis. And we'll be talking a little bit later what some steps you can take to do that. Risk management will never prevent a lawsuit. People sue for the stupidest things on earth, and there are attorneys out there who will take those lawsuits. So it's not going to prevent lawsuits, but what risk management will do is it will aid in defending your actions if you've taken steps to manage the risks that are inherent in your athletic program. There are 14 duties to plan. I'm going to be going through all 14 of these, and to make it easy for you, they're all listed at the end of the PowerPoint. The first one is the duty to plan. It's important that athletic directors review and revise all necessary forms prior to the season, especially those that require signatures. There are changes in the law that can occur. There are changes in school procedures that can occur, and there can be changes in the state statutes. And you want to make sure that you're meeting all of the requirements that you can in your forms. Prepare a parent-athlete handbook and a coach's procedure manual, and then update rules on a yearly basis, or if something else happens and it's necessary for you to update them. Now, to make it easy for you, I'm going to tell you again, there's a parent-athlete handbook on the WADA site and a coach's procedure manual and all the forms. I'm not asking you to use it as it's written, but it's certainly a template. And before each item in that parent-athlete handbook and coach's procedure manual is an explanatory paragraph explaining why you need that particular paragraph in your parent-athlete handbook. Prepare materials for coaches and agendas for all meetings. The reason for having agendas and then taking minutes is so you have a written record of what you did in case you need it at a later date, or in case somebody says to you, you never told me. Make sure that your coaches are planning practices, are preparing game plans. Make sure that they put training and safety rules in writing. Make sure they put awards criteria in writing, and make sure they're keeping accurate records. And this will become very, very clear later, but I want to say something about the awards criteria. Many coaches will just say, well, that was a good student. That's not a criteria for giving an award. They should have specific objective criteria regarding why someone gets a most improved, a letter, etc. The second duty is the duty to supervise. This is the one that creates the highest number of lawsuits in the educational field. Coaches are responsible for supervising practice areas. That does not mean that they can stay in the coach's office and let students run a warm-up. They may think that the warm-up is being run, but they have no idea what's going on. So it's incumbent upon coaches to also supervise practice areas. It's incumbent upon them to supervise after games. The third one that creates a problem a lot is supervising in the locker room. And I want to talk about that a little bit, because a question that always comes up is, what if there's an opposite gender coach? There are several things you can do with an opposite gender coach, and there is a form on the website that will explain to you how you send the letter out to the parents, and there's a sample letter. But here's the reality. If you have a female team and a male coach, obviously the male coach isn't going to be going into the locker room. So let's handle that first. Several things the coach can do. If you have a female assistant, send the female in there. If there's a paraprofessional that's on duty at the time, send the paraprofessional in there. If neither of those is feasible. And if there is not a female coach coaching another sport at that time who's willing to help, and that's not feasible, what a lot of coaches will do is take senior students, put a senior captain or another responsible student who will supervise, in quotes, in the locker room. If anything happens, the student should be told that that supervisory student is going to come out and get the coach. The coach will then open the door and say, I'm going to count to 10, and when I get to 10, I'm coming in the locker room. Please make sure you're decent, and then the opposite gender coach can enter the locker room. Those are your options. Those are the viable options. Supervising on the bus. There are 3 places that coaches sit on the bus. The majority sit in the middle. The majority sit in the front. Some sit in the middle. Very few sit in the rear. The best place to sit on the bus is in the rear, because you cannot supervise a bus if you're sitting in the front and you don't have eyes in the back of your head. So the best place to supervise is from the back of the bus. If you have activity buses that take students home when practices are over, then at least one coach should be assigned from all of the sports that are affected by this in a given season to supervise in the activity bus area. There have been some pretty nasty things that have happened in activity bus areas. So you want to set up someone to supervise in the activity bus area. Overnight stays. This is a really tricky one. I have had coaches, I had a tennis coach at one time who, after the curfew, went to every room in the hotel, put tape on the door, and there was a coach on that staff that was actually stationed in the hallway. Now that's the most severe way of supervising. But you want to make sure that your students have the rules and that there's someone supervising in an overnight stay. It gets really dicey if the stay is in many homes in a different community, or if the stay is at, for example, a cabin that's been lent to the coach for students to stay in for a tournament. Technically, the duty to supervise takes place anytime an athletic director or coach is in an official capacity representing the school. And that means if the coach runs a barbecue at his or her home for the students, the coach is still in an official capacity representing the school, and anything that happens could come back to the school. The third duty is the duty to assess athlete readiness for practice and competition. Prior to the start of the season, it's incumbent on the athletic director to make sure that all athletes who are participating in any way, and that means practices or games, are properly screened regarding eligibility and physicals. Now, you may run into a problem if you have an athlete coming from overseas and you need to double check whether they're writing the date as as month, day, year, or as day, month, year, because you could get caught by the April 1st date if you don't check that. It's especially important to check transfer athletes, regardless of whether it's public to public, public to private, or private to public. And there should be an ongoing monitoring of the condition of athletes. Athletes, for the most part, do not want to tell you when they have been injured. So it's important that the coaches monitor the athletes and that the AD, if he or she sees something, can always contact the coach or even pull the student in. I want to talk a little bit about HIPAA release. The HIPAA release is the release that's required by law for people to be signed if you're in a hospital and you want information released. It's a signed authorization for medical providers to release patient information to the school and to designated personnel. There is a HIPAA release in the forms that I have online, but you should designate in the form, whether it's athletic trainer, athletic AD, or coach, or anybody else, because there are federal requirements regarding content, and you should specify the purpose and the extent of the authorization. For example, we are asking for this information to be released so that the athletic trainer at the school can work with any rehab that's necessary. Now, there is a quasi-release that's on the WIAA form, but it doesn't include all of this information. And while it has not yet been challenged, the possibility exists that it could be challenged. The fourth duty is the duty to maintain safe playing conditions. It's exactly what it says. Inspect the facilities prior to practices or games for safety and compliance with National Federation regulations. Report problems immediately in writing and do a preventative approach, not a reactive approach. Okay, here's the problem. If you have a turnover in coaches, if you have a turnover in athletic directors, if something hasn't been handled the prior year, if you as a new AD coming to that school does not inspect the facilities prior to the practices or games, if your coaches don't inspect the facilities prior to practices or games, you are not going to know if there are any problems there. And if a student is injured due to an unsafe playing condition, the school could be liable. The reason for reporting problems immediately in writing to proper authorities is if you are in fact using a facility that is not a school facility and you find that there are problems with that facility, the best way to cover yourself, obviously, is to stop using it. But if that's not feasible, then send a letter to whatever department or entity is responsible for maintaining that field. A lot of people use park fields or recreational fields, and in that case, it would go to those people. You want to use a preventative approach and not a reactive approach. Duty to provide proper equipment. This may seem a simple thing to you. However, it doesn't happen. It just doesn't happen. All equipment must be sanitary, clean, and good working order and meet National Federation high school requirements. I'm going to tell you about a phone call I got once. This was not from a Milwaukee school. It was from a suburban school. And I actually called the school after a parent called me. And I said, I have received a phone call from a parent. You have had, and this is accurate, you have had 5 clavicles broken in the first week of football practice. You have a problem with your shoulder pads, and your shoulder pads need to be checked. So they checked the shoulder pads, and they had to replace over 50 sets of shoulder pads. They still had the old shoulder pads that had the horsehair padding in them, and they were using it for the lower level. So you've got to be very, very careful and not assume anything. Make sure all of the equipment meets all of the National Federation requirements. Check it prior to the season, check it during the season, and then after the season, check it to make sure the equipment that needs to be sent out and either certified for NOC or cleaned and sanitized is sent out. And report problems immediately so you can address the problem. Excuse me. The 6th duty to instruct is a duty to instruct properly. Now, most of you are teachers, some of you may not be. Lesson plans should include elements of a successful practice. Are the coaches doing warm-ups? Are they doing weight training? Are they doing cardiovascular conditioning? Are they teaching you proper skills? Are they teaching proper plays? And are they doing a cool down? This is simple stuff, folks, but they don't always do it. The progression should be simple to complex. And the coaches are in the best position to determine if an athlete is ready physically or mentally, and it's up to you to determine if they're eligible. Now, there's a safety issue called informed consent. I'm going to be talking about that later, but it also plays into the duty to instruct properly. If your coach is teaching a new skill, for example, I'm going to use football, I'm going to use tackling. If the coach does not teach tackling correctly and says, and this actually happened, it's okay to hit the thorax version of the opponent with your head, then if anything happens to that student, the school's going to be liable. That's called spearing. The coaches need to say, this is the appropriate way to tackle. Keep your head to the side, aim with your shoulder, on and on. If you do not do this, you will put yourself at risk. The same thing holds true for wrestling. It holds true for gymnastics. It holds true for diving. It holds true for any new skill. Not only should they be explaining the skill, but they should also be explaining what will happen if they don't do it correctly. That's a part of informed consent. Duty to match athletes. All right, size, weight, skill, experience. The bottom line with this is you can't control it, and you can't control opposing team members. And it happens the most in football. The most any coach can do is talk to an opposing coach and say, look, I'm down on numbers this year. It would be all right if you didn't play your first string, and warn your players. It's not appropriate for a coach to take a team off the field unless it is a major safety issue. And that is the only time that I would have allowed my coaches to take anybody off the field. It has to be a major safety issue. And in those cases, the official should be stopping it so the coach didn't have to take action. But it's better to deal with that afterwards than it is to tell them ahead of time. So use your discretion. Duty to provide proper physical conditioning. If you look at the PowerPoint and you see that all is in all caps, this is still happening in some schools. All athletes do not have access to the weight room. All athletes are not being trained how to use the weight room. All athletes are not being trained about the safety procedures they should follow when they're doing the weight training. And there are still some schools where weight training does not include sport-specific exercises. So I would just ask that you meet with your coaches and check to make sure that all of the athletes, female and male, individual sports and team sports, have access to the weight room, and that the weight training does include sport-specific exercises. In addition to that, the coaches during their warm-up can always be doing flexibility training and cardiovascular conditioning. Duty to warn. This came out of a $6 million lawsuit in Seattle, Washington regarding an accident that occurred with a football helmet. And this is the one that actually pushed the development of football helmets, but it also pushed the issue known as informed consent. And what informed consent is, nobody can consent to anybody doing anything unless they get the information ahead of time regarding what can happen. So information should be given to parents, guardians, and athletes prior to beginning practices, and you should require a signature. This is another reason why the safety rules should be put in writing by the coaches so that they have a proof regarding what they told the students. And if athletes are not at a practice on the day on which the safety rules were handed out, or they were not at a meeting where they were handed out, then the coach needs to take attendance and make sure that the students get those safety rules when they do reappear. And explaining the safety precautions for new skills, we already talked about that. Here is an informed consent sample. And when this first started, athletic directors and coaches had a fit because they said, if I tell parents this, they're not going to let their kids come out for sports. Well, if you don't tell them what could happen and something happens, you're going to be in a lot worse trouble. So injuries can occur as a result of participation. they can include, and you list everything they can include, and you tell them that it's possible that a catastrophic injury could occur that would render my son or daughter paralyzed, and death could also occur as a result of a catastrophic injury. The reality is most parents don't read it, they just sign it. If they do read it and they have questions, simply explain to them the precautions that you are asking coaches to take, the precautions that you take in your school with an athletic trainer, the precautions you take when you have medical people at football games or at major invitationals, and tell them you're doing everything you can to keep the athletes safe, and you can explain the safety equipment that's also being used. Duty to ensure that athletes are covered by medical insurance. This is one of the 14 duties of care that was determined by lawsuits, but it's not required by the WIAA. However, it has come up in litigation that schools should inform individuals, parents, and students that athletes are not covered, and that the parents should ensure that the athletes are covered. Now, what we started to do, and what I suggest to schools when I went out and did risk assessments, is that you put a statement in the parent-athlete handbook that says the school does not provide insurance in cases of medical injury and will not pay for the conveyance by an ambulance. Therefore, we require all students to be covered by medical insurance. And when the students come in to register as an athlete each year, they should show evidence of coverage as part of that registration process. Have them bring in the actual insurance card and do a copy of the insurance card. Because what if you just ask them, do you have insurance? And they say yes, and they do not have it. The fault will come back to you for not checking. If you have them show evidence of coverage, then you're pretty much going to be covered for this. And if you don't require it, then explain in writing what the school is not liable for. So the best case scenario is explain either that it's not required and that the school is not going to be liable, or require insurance coverage and then ask for the card. Those are your two choices. Duty to provide emergency care. All of your coaches should be trained in first aid, CPR, and AED. This is a precaution, and when coaches say to you, well, we have an athletic trainer that's on site, that athletic trainer is not at every practice and is not at every game. And it's incumbent upon the coaches to at least have some rudimentary first aid, CPR, and AED training so that if something does happen, they can at least take some steps. We never require them to take steps beyond what they are capable of doing. And coaches will have varying degrees of training. Some will have gone and gotten athletic training, so they'll know how to tape ankles or tape knees or use kinesio tape. But again, it's up to you to determine at what level you want your coaches to be trained. At the least, they should have training in first aid, CPR, and AED. The concussion management training is required by the WIA, is required by the state. Now, let's talk about who is at your football games, at your invitationals, and at WIA tournaments. The best case scenario is an athletic trainer or a sports medicine physician. The worst case scenario is to get on the PA system and say, is there a physician in the house? You want to provide as much coverage as you can for your athletes. It's required basically at football games to have at least an ambulance there. But it's not required at large invitationals, and the WIAA at the state level takes care of it, and you're responsible for taking care of it on your site. But what I'm suggesting to you is that when you have high-risk events or you have large invitationals, that you have either an athletic trainer or sports medicine physician there. If you want to have an emergency vehicle there, have an emergency vehicle there. I have seen EMTs who worked for emergency vehicles handle athletes in a not appropriate fashion. So your best bet is really the sports medicine physician or the athletic trainer. Check the necessary first aid equipment, maintain the first aid kits, maintain this AED, and unconscious athletes, as you well know, require special clearance before resuming participation, especially if it's been determined that they have a concussion. Okay, here's an emergency contact card. You have two choices. You can either have them do an emergency contact card, put them in a Ziploc bag, put them in the first aid kit that's used by the coach, and each coach on each level in each sport should have this, or you can make it available electronically so the coaches have it on their cell phones. Either one will work. The bottom line is wherever they put it, it needs to be available immediately to a coach in case a student is injured. I've already had EMTs, fire departments come and say, what's the student's name? They have the student's name. What is the student's contact? I don't know. Well, where's your information? Well, I think it's back in my desk somewhere. Well, it isn't going to do any good in the desk. This is the type of information that will help an EMT, a paramedic, immediately take charge and help that student. Now, I suggest that there should be a student-athlete accident report. Why? Because most school accident reports are not as comprehensive and do not angle towards an interscholastic athletic event. And I'm going to go through some of these and explain why they're in the student-athlete accident report. If emergency personnel were called, list the full name, badge, or ID numbers, and accompany the individuals. Why? Because if 2 years down the road, somebody sues the school because the student was injured, you will not have this information. And if you go back to the provider, you won't get the information because they know why you're asking. So make sure that you get this type of information on your student-athlete accident report. Was the athlete conveyed to the hospital? What hospital? When and by whom were parents and guardians notified of the accident? This is very important because this goes to mitigating any consequences that might come about as a result of the accident. So the AD and or the head coach should be contacting the parents or guardians and say, I'm calling to let you know, or I'm calling to check, or how is so-and-so doing, so that they understand that the school is very, very concerned about what has occurred. Who obtained the written witness statements? List all the information for the witnesses, attach the witness statements and a full written description, and submit the reports to the AD within 48 hours. Keep it on file for 3 years. The statute of limitations on a civil suit is 3 years in the state of Wisconsin. Duty to develop an emergency response plan. During the time that I went out and did risk assessments, I covered approximately 50 schools in the state of Wisconsin. Of those 50 schools, one school practiced an emergency response plan. One coach at that school practiced it. It's not enough to have it. It has to be practiced, and each coach should be practicing what to do in case of an emergency with his or her athletes. It coincides with the duty to provide emergency care. There should be an emergency response plan for all sites at which a team will practice or compete. And this gets especially important for a sport like cross country where they're running all over the place. There should be established routes. There should be established ways that they are running, either in groups. There should be a coach in the front and a coach behind. And if they cannot do that and there's only one coach, coach should be on a bicycle or something else where they can at least monitor what the students are doing. There should be contingency plans for severe weather or facility failure. For example, if you're in a gym and the lights go completely out and there are no windows, do you have emergency lighting? And do you have an emergency method to contact the people in that facility to direct them on what they should do until the lights come back on, or how they should exit? And that means a bullhorn. You cannot rely on electricity, because if the light goes out, so will your PA system. And obviously, the use of cellular phones now is a big plus. The 13th duty is the duty to provide safe transportation. The bottom line in the state of Wisconsin is use chartered vehicles. Because if you use a chartered vehicle, the vendor assumes all liability in case of accident. It does not come back to the school. Now, the second one creates problems. Athletes should never drive other athletes to practices or competitive events. This is not feasible in certain rural areas. It's not feasible even in some urban areas. So the form that I created, that's a liability waiver for transportation, states 4 different situations that might arise. And the fourth one is if athletes have to drive athletes. And it explains in the liability waiver where the liability will ride. Basically, all athletes should ride the team bus to and from events. If a parent wants to take a student home, that really should be arranged ahead of time. If there's an emergency, then the coach should okay it on the spot, get the parents to sign, and watch the student get into the car with the parent. Any liability waivers should meet the criteria established by 2 cases in the state of Wisconsin. One of them is Supreme Court and Yager Skiing Enterprises, and the other one is Atkins v. Swim West. These are all met in the form that I drew up for you. Criteria for a waiver: if you have to write a waiver for a clinic that you're holding, for a sports clinic, for special training, for camp, here's the criteria. Clear, unambiguous, and unmistakable in its meaning, that the signer is waiving all claims due to the negligence of the owner of the facility, must clearly and unequivocally communicate the nature and significance of the document. If you are interested and go back and check Yager v. Skiing Enterprises and Atkins v. Swim West, you'll see the dismal waivers that were used, and that's what made this happen. Must be conspicuous, has to be in a separately titled section, different color print, italicized, put a border around it. The waiver has to be separately signed. It cannot be included as part of the normal information that you would give to parents to sign for students to come out. Has to be on the front of a 1-page contract. If it's on the reverse, you have to say it's on the front page. If it's part of a multi-page, you have to put it on the first page. It should be very, very clear, not legal jargon, and have a heading that is not misleading. That's basically it. But all of those criteria are met in the transportation liability waiver that is available under the forms folder on the WADA site, and it will be available on the WIA site. The duty to select, train, and supervise coaches. And I will bet at this point that there are many coaches and ADs that are just shaking their heads and saying it isn't going to happen because we need a warm body. Well, you have to establish hiring forms and procedures if you want to cover yourself. Adhere to WIA requirements for non-teacher coaches. Discuss job requirements and job expectations. You cannot expect somebody to do something if they haven't been told ahead of time what the expectations are. Do not wait to intervene as an athletic director. If you hear that something is happening, please take action immediately and establish a clear line of authority. If in some schools, the teacher is in the same bargaining unit as the coach, if you're a teacher in the same bargaining unit as the coaches, the AD is in the same bargaining unit as the teachers. Okay. We're going on to policy on privacy in locker rooms. This is Wisconsin State Statute 175.22. This policy includes people, meaning the state, a recording device, meaning anything, camera, a video recorder, a cell phone that can be used to record or transfer images. Any person that owns or operates a locker room in this state has to adopt a written policy that does all of the following: who may enter and remain, specify the recording devices that can be used, reflects the privacy interests, and specifies that no person may use a cell phone. This should be in writing. Okay, we're going on to Title IX. You hear the term Title IX thrown around quite a bit recently, but you also hear it thrown around dealing with sexual harassment. That came about as a result of law cases. It did not come about as a result of what was stated in the original Title IX. But basically, Title IX says you can't include anybody on the basis of sex from participation in an interscholastic athletic activity or any activity, discrimination under any education program or activity. Those are the sites. Office of Civil Rights is responsible for compliance. Now, as a result of Title IX, many states also enacted a law, and in the state of Wisconsin, it's Public Law 9. And I'd like to just refer you to a certain section on this. May not be denied the benefits of or be discriminated against in any curricular, extracurricular, pupil services, on and on, because of sex, race, religion, national origin, ancestry, creed, pregnancy, marital or parental status, sexual orientation, or physical, mental, emotional, or learning disability. So if you have a student that comes out and is an amputee, the student cannot be denied access to the program. If you have a Special Olympics student that comes out, or cognitively delayed student, and is capable of following the directions and being a part of the team, you cannot deny that. My best suggestion to you is that you start some type of Special Olympic program or unified program at your school. These are the program areas that were originally included in Title IX. Provision and maintenance of equipment and supplies, scheduling, travel and per diem allowances, academic tutoring and compensation of tutors, opportunity to receive coaching, and assignment and compensation of coaches. The opportunity to receive coaching and assignment and compensation may still be an issue in some schools. I am guessing that most schools have brought the compensation for coaches in line. If at your school you discover it has not been brought in line, then I would say please address it with the school board. The scheduling of games and practice times is another issue. For the most part, the state of Wisconsin has pretty much handled this, except schools may not have handled it. And if you start getting complaints on this, I would say please address them or give me a call and I'll give you some suggestions. Locker rooms, practice, and competitive facilities. You cannot have a baseball field that is well-groomed, has lights, has fences, has dugouts, and not do the same thing for your softball team. That's the bottom line. That's the area where it comes up a lot. Other program areas, medical and training facilities and services. We talked about that earlier when we talked about access to weight training and to the athletic trainer. Publicity. You cannot control what the papers are going to do or what the media will do to publicize your program, but you can control what you release to them. So that's the major thing in that area. Support services are pep bands and cheerleaders. And the recruitment of student athletes, you should be recruiting all athletes in your program in the same way. regardless of the sport and regardless of the gender. Now, there are some non-discriminatory exceptions. The unique nature of the particular sport. This is, does it take more security to run some games than it takes other games? Does it take more money to provide uniforms for some teams than it does for other teams? That's what they're talking about when they say unique nature of the sport. Or special circumstances of a temporary nature. The girls don't have a locker room or the boys don't have a locker room, but the school is in the process of correcting that. The need for greater funding for crowd control, talked about that. The differences haven't been remedied, but the institution is voluntarily working to correct. Sport distinctions. Well, initially, Title IX made a distinction between non-contact sports and contact sports. Except in the state of Wisconsin and in the Seventh Circuit, which covers the state of Wisconsin, Judge John Rendels, in a case called Leffel versus the WIAA, said you have three choices. If the boys have the sport and the girls don't have the sport, the girls can go out for the boys' sport. You can create a program for the girls, or you can cancel the boys' sport. And he made no distinction whatsoever between non-contact and contact sports. So that's what we're stuck with in the state of Wisconsin. Hence, girls can go out for football and wrestling and couldn't before. There it is, Leffel versus the WIAA. Seventh Circuit, those are your three choices. I'd like to talk a little bit about sexual harassment and assault. The responsibility of the coach and of the athletic director and ultimately of the school and the school board is to respond promptly and effectively and investigate even if the parents don't want to file a complaint. It's our responsibility as educators to protect the students who are placed in our care. Therefore, it's up to us to respond promptly and effectively and investigate. You should distribute a policy on what you're going to do in cases of sexual harassment. You're required by federal law to have a Title IX coordinator, and you must have established procedures and make them known on how to file complaints of sex discrimination, including sexual harassment or sexual assault. Students do not want to report these items, any type of sexual discrimination, any type of harassment, any type of assault, any type of bullying, because they're afraid it will affect their place on the team, their prominence on the team, their ability to play as much as they're currently playing. That's the reason for having a Title IX coordinator. That's the reason for having somebody completely non-related who can listen to these complaints and respond. I want to talk a little bit about concussion. It is a traumatic brain injury. Don't call it anything else. It's a traumatic brain injury that interferes with the normal functioning of the brain. It's an injury to the brain. And it can be caused by a blow to the head or a body that twists the brain and the skull. It does not necessarily cause unconsciousness. And there are many times when this might occur. And the students will not tell you that, well, I'm having trouble seeing, or coach, what was that you said about that play? Here are the signs of a possible concussion. These are also available on the WIAA site. Dazed or stunned appearance, change in the level of consciousness, confused, forgets plays, unsure, shows behavior changes. You can read those on your own. Symptoms: headache, nausea, dizziness, sensitivity to light, feeling mentally foggy, problems with concentration, confused and slow. If you think a student's going to come up to you and say, hey, coach, I got hit on that last play and I'm starting to get a headache, it isn't going to happen. It's up to the coaches to ask the students. And what I suggest is there's a sideline test that can be done. I think it's called SCAT. That's a real easy test. You can do it before the season starts, you can do it in case of any injury, and you can tell immediately if there's a difference in the student's cognitive ability. Immediately seek emergency medical help if any of these occur: loss of consciousness, unusual drowsiness, severe worsening headache, seizure, vomiting, difficulty breathing. Here are the realities of concussions. And these are from the 2011-12 school year. 26% of competition injuries and 18% of practice injuries are concussions. 69% of the 497 fatalities in football were due to brain injuries. The athletes don't tell coaches. The coaches are not fully aware of all hits on the field. The parents discount the severity because they want the kids to play. And the highest ones are actually football, soccer, wrestling, and cheerleading. And soccer because of the head-butting of the ball. So if you're playing high school soccer, that should not be occurring. Okay, special issues for athletes. High school athletes are more vulnerable to concussions. There's a longer period of recovery. They're less likely to go through medical screening. They have no access to a team doctor or trainer when a concussion occurs. And it may be a higher duty for sports organizations, schools, coaches, healthcare to protect the health and safety of the youth. At this point, we are not aware of any suits that have been filed against schools for failure to take action in case of a concussion. But I would make an educated guess that will probably happen. When in doubt, sit them out. If they're returning to play, utilize graduated steps. Make sure you have on file a written clearance. Utilize some sort of written evaluation and monitor that coaches are complying with the procedure. In summary, for risk management, develop a written concussion management plan, implement the concussion policies, comply with the concussion policies, use athletic trainers whenever possible, train coaches, use proper safety equipment, utilize a baseline test such as SCAT, which I mentioned earlier, also has a sideline assessment tool, and follow all the necessary rules from the WIAA, the DPI, and Wisconsin statutes. Your responsibility as an athletic administrator: monitor programs, monitor funds, especially in booster clubs. If you have any questions regarding booster clubs, I'll handle those either now or you can send me an email or call me. Monitor scholarships, monitor uniforms, equipment, and facilities, monitor coaches for compliance with all regulations, provide equal access to all tutoring, medical, and athletic training and facilities, and address inequities in an expedient fashion. As an athletic administrator, to ensure consistency in your program, establish your basic philosophy of high school sports and adhere to it. And your basic philosophy should not be to win at all costs. It should be an extension of the educational process on the high school level. Whatever it is, adhere to it. Be consistent regardless of who is concerned. Do not tolerate rules being broken by anyone regardless of the pressure that is being put on you. When deviations become necessary, they should be few and far between and totally defensible. I'll give you an example. When Jeffrey Dahmer was killing young men in the city of Milwaukee, one of the young men that was killed was the brother of a student that was a soccer player at Pulaski High School, and his grades just took a dive. And we wrote up a special plan for him that allowed him to be provisionally eligible. That was totally defensible, but it also had criteria that had to be met. Ultimately, it's an issue of how much you value integrity, yourself, your reputation, and fair play. And remember, ask what if. If it's not in writing, it doesn't exist. Here are the 14 duties of care, and that is my contact information. Thank you very much for your attention. I hope this is helpful as you start your career as an athletic administrator. And if you have any questions, I can take some questions now, or you can send them to me at my Hotmail address or by phone.
Great job, Jan. Thanks so much. Very well done. I have one quick one for you that came my way this past week, which was kind of interesting, and it's with regard to booster clubs. Perhaps it'll get a little conversation. You were just alluding to it. And the question that came my way was, what is the limit a booster club in Wisconsin can pay a coach? I found that to be a rather interesting question. I thought it might be one that you might like to discuss.
What is the limit in the state of Wisconsin that a booster club can pay a coach?
Yes. Is there any limit?
0. The booster clubs are not the ones who pay coaches. The schools pay coaches.
Yep.
That's the simple answer. If a booster club has worked out something with the school to pay a coach, the money should be given to the school, and the school should be paying the coach. But to pay bonuses or anything like that, to pay for coaches that are essentially volunteer coaches or are not on the pay of the school is inappropriate, and it's probably illegal.
That is what I was looking for you to relay to them. Thank you so much. Exactly how I responded as well. I have had one question that came from Courtney. Where do we find the recordings of these presentations? On the website, Courtney and everyone, AD Resources, we will have workshop number 2, Jan's legal issues presentation, all located there for you. It'll be probably right under workshop number 1 that we did a week or so ago. That whole recording was there. Any other questions for Jan? Please feel free to unmute yourself and ask any questions that you might have. Give you a couple of minutes to do so. Actually, I'll unmute everyone. There you go. Everyone's unmuted. If you have any questions for Jan, you feel free to ask away at this time. I would also just point out during the presentation, the one update that has occurred within the last year is that the WIA now requires all paid coaches to complete CPR, AED, and what's the other one that we have? First aid and first aid training. So all paid coaches, a reminder that they do have to have that to be a coach for a WIA school team.
And I'd like to add, even if they're volunteer coaches that are helping during a given season, they should also be required by your school to have first aid, CPR, and AED, especially if they're taking either athletes off to the side and you're doing stations, or even if they're doing a lower level team, they really should have the training.
I concur completely. Anything else from anybody? Okay.
This is Courtney.
Right.
Thank you guys very much for the presentation.
Great. Thank you so much. If there's nothing further, we will conclude. And I thank you all for watching and being part of things. Much appreciated. Jan, outstanding job once again. Thanks for sharing all those insights with us.
You are quite welcome.
Everyone, this concludes the workshop number 2 Zoom meeting. And again, thanks for attending. We'll be in touch. September 13th is the next one, as I mentioned. We'll look forward to seeing you then. Thanks again.
Bye, Tom.
Okay, Jan, thank you.
You're welcome.
I really appreciate it. I'll get
that information to you as soon as I can.
Yes, you get me that info. We'll be glad to post that for you.
Okay.
All right, kiddo. You bet. Stay in touch. I will do the same.
Okay, I have a question.
Go ahead.
The presentation, a lot of the names disappeared, a lot of the faces disappeared, and only the names came up. Does that mean they left the presentation?
Yes.